Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Beau Taillefer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 2, Episode 6, Induction.
All right, Eric, we're going to talk about possibly my most favorite topic in education today.
Induction. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, we want to talk about how in Gordon's model with the skill learning sequence, we have these two wings of discrimination learning and inference learning, and this is his system for classifying how we learn in a very general sense. We often talk about Siegfried Engelmann on this podcast just because of his profound inspiration on us. But Engelmann has this concept of induction, and longtime listeners of the podcast might notice we often draw parallels between inductive learning in Engelmann's model and inference learning in Gordon's model. But over some conversations that we've had recently, I was claiming that Gordon's model really needs this concept of inductive learning. It's not covered by either discrimination learning or inference learning. And Gordon does eclipse this topic. He knows about it. He knows about same and differences. But Engelmann brings a level of precision to this conversation that's very, I think, useful for the MLT philosophy or MLT way of learning music. So let's just start with, I'm going to read Gordon's definition of discrimination learning, and then I'd like to get you to riff off of it, how you would explain it to someone who knows nothing about MLT. So this is straight out of Learning Sequences in Music. Discrimination learning, lower of two generic types of skill learning. In discrimination learning, students are taught skills and patterns through imitation. Discrimination learning includes oral, verbal association, partial synthesis, symbolic association, reading, all the way down the learning sequence. Discrimination learning is readiness for inference learning. So it covers that whole left side of the sequence. So, I mean, in your own words, Eric, how would you explain this to somebody who didn't know anything about MLT and you were trying to, put a flag in the ground here?
Well, it's interesting to me because when I hear that, all kinds of alarms go off a little bit because there is no inference learning without discrimination, of course. But there's also no discrimination learning without some inference that goes on. So we're gonna get to that because. But before you get there, it's like we just need to know your basic patterns. Just start with patterns because patterns is how we understand tonality, and patterns is how we understand, meter, and you need vocabulary to do that. The vocabulary is something you've listened to, and now something that you're imitating, and then later you audiate it, and at some point when enough of the kids in the class audiate that, you move on to the next level, or you can go on to the next content. So you could change from major to minor, duple to triple, or whatever, or you can raise the learning sequence activity to the next, now we've done oral patterns on bum for tones and ba for rhythm, which has its own issues there, because it's not great for little mouths, but we're not going to derail that train yet. But once you have those patterns, then you can do them different ways. Sing the middle note, or sing the first note, or sing. You could do different things with them, and then you make it more difficult. Or you can go on to verbal association, which is just singing exactly the same patterns, but all you're doing is incorporating the verbal associations to them, the verbal associates.
Mm-hmm. And so no matter where you are on the sequence, whether you're in oral, verbal association, this is stuff that's being explicitly taught by the teacher to the student. Just boom, This is how you do it.
I present it, the kid responds appropriately, or the class responds appropriately, and it's just follow directions, be a monkey. Really. You don't need to do much thinking.
And I would include it learning by rote on an instrument. Like if you're sitting at a keyboard with a student and you're just saying, hey, copy this down, ding, 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 that falls under this type of learning. It's learning through imitating something.
Yeah.
Whether it's on an instrument or with your voice or whatever.
You're imitating it and then starting to bring meaning to what you're imitating, so eventually you're audiating it. And you need kids to go through that. It's a very crucial thing for kids that are 3, 4, or 5 years old to get them into audiation by, a lot of content, by giving them a lot of variety of content.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting about this is people can learn to audiate without actually singing out loud. And I've done this a lot on the piano with students who are uncomfortable to sing for the first, month or so of lessons. And so, and this is also related to your own harmonic learning sequence, because you can't ask a student to sing a harmonic structure unless you get them to do it through a tonal pattern. But that's not what I'm talking about, because with the tonal pattern has to be sung through time. They can't literally sing 4 notes at once or 3 notes at once.
Obviously one of the biggest issues I have at this, if you're starting kids, do tonal patterns, do rhythm patterns. I do them, all the time, but they can't be taught to imitate these patterns because they're not patterns that you can sing. You can't sing 3 notes at the same time. So
this brings up this distinction that I want to make, or this point about discrimination learning in Gordon's model. The imitation. So you go through oral, verbal association. You could theoretically do that without having someone sing. But the point of getting them to sing it is that it gives the teacher and hopefully the student feedback that they're actually audiating the correct thing at some level. Because it's a way of proving that they're audiating the right thing. Because if they're not hitting the pitches correctly, if they're scooping the notes or doing whatever, you can tell that they're not actually audiating it properly. So this imitation thing is a very good feedback mechanism to see where they are in the process. But with things like learning how to hear functions, which I'm Eric's biggest cheerleader. Like Ron and I are probably your biggest fans. Anyone else can join us. We can make a pyramid pretty soon if we get enough of us. But the point with learning how to hear harmonic functions in this way that you describe in the harmonic learning sequence, what's weird is you're teaching them to make discriminations, but they can't imitate it with their voice. So it's proof that this is possible.
Yeah.
So the discriminations are not dependent on the person actually imitating it. It can help the process.
Yes.
Because if you sing something and it sounds different than what your teacher is saying, you start doing this inductive learning where you're like, well, that doesn't sound right. You're not audiating the right thing. But I think that's so important to notice is that for harmony especially, how do you learn to hear harmony through discrimination learning if you can't sing functions? I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I mean, it's why I'm on Eric's side on this. If there is a side,
well, the kids show you how they're learning, and if they can do it, well, why aren't we teaching it? There's no reason not to be. And so, if the kids can do it, how do you get there if they can't sing the patterns back, right? Because they can't sing harmony. So therefore, we have we need a new teaching context, say, an instructional context, or it's
instructional concept. We need a new concept that explains why what you're doing works and why it doesn't fit in this model. Yeah. Because in this model, discrimination learning has imitation as part of the definition, but it's not, I think, as precise as it could be. Because it's not accounting for what
there's nothing wrong in Gordon's, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. There's just more juice to be squeezed out of that lemon.
I think so. So if we go on to now just inference learning, this is from learning sequences. Higher of 2 generic types of skill learning. In inference learning, students are guided by the teacher to learn skills in tonal and rhythm patterns by teaching themselves. Students are not taught by imitation or inference learning. I'm going to skip the rest of it because it's just a huge rehashing of oral. It's going through all the discrimination learning phases basically, but yeah. You're teaching yourself to discover new patterns.
It's where you're teaching by rote to imitate what the teacher's presenting.
You mean not by rote?
For inference.
For inference. Yeah.
Not by rote. So you're making your own connections. You're drawing your own inferences from connections you've made because of your aptitude and the amount of the content you've had in terms of tonalities, meters, and harmonic functions.
So, for example, I mean, a classic example is this: someone knows a tonal pattern, bum, 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 and they're singing that, and then one day they're improvising, and what comes out is bum, 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 and they've never heard that pattern before. I mean, I don't know how, but so the mind is doing something that's rearranging, the Lego blocks of their audiation there, but not explicitly. They didn't necessarily consciously think, well, hey, I'm going to flip this last note around. It kind of happens at a more intuitive level.
Yeah, you give a student a problem, they have to figure their way out, where in inference learning, or they figure shit out on their own, which is inference learning, right? Mm-hmm. So, and how they get there is best done if there's other people around them also drawing inferences and showing the way, beyond the teacher.
What's very ironic about this, you can through imitation teach someone how to engage in creativity, which is funny because I'm sitting at the piano with kids and they'll see me improvising on a melody or changing the rhythms, and I don't even say anything. Yeah. And then just after a couple of weeks, they start doing that too. So they kind of got the idea that it was possible through imitation, but they're making their own patterns up. They're making their own.
I think it was
calling the shots.
First thing I said was there is no imitation without some inference, and there's inferential stuff that can't be without inference. Without discrimination learning. There is no inference without discrimination learning, and vice versa. Yep.
Okay, so we have some basic definitions here. Now let's bring Engelman into the party. So I'm looking at the book Theory of Instruction, which might as well be an anvil in terms of its weight. I just searched the copy I have of it, and I just searched for induction, and the first thing that comes up, it's in the early part of the book. He has this definition: the learning of basic discriminations or concepts is inductive. Now, before anyone freaks out, the word concept here does not mean theoretical ideas in Gordon's language. It means you could rephrase this sentence for a music audience: the learning of basic discriminations or musical patterns is inductive. So this is the whole bone I have to pick with the way Gordon defined discrimination learning. I'm excited because this was kind of in my subconscious for a while, but I think it's coming up now. Gordon talks about discriminations being learned through imitation and copying, which I'm a big fan of. But the way Engelman talks about the learning of basic discriminations is dependent on hearing variations in those musical patterns. For example, if you hear, commonly what's done in partial synthesis is after someone can hear duple and triple patterns, you're helping them label the two and synthesize the verbal associate into more meaning there. But if you rewind this whole process back to ground zero, I mean, why does Gordon say we have to learn same and different? Because at a very intuitive level, if you don't know a pattern, if you don't know basic patterns in triple, you're not going to hear the basic patterns in duple the same way. And so what is that process? I mean, Gordon just calls it, same and different, and I mean, he has his terms for it. But the way Engelman is talking about it is more precise in terms of you literally need variation in the patterns to even understand the original pattern. So if we ask a student to copy a tonal pattern or a rhythm pattern and they spit out the exact thing, we can be certain that they're audiating it, at least for a second. It might not be in their long-term memory because they just proved it. But the precision that comes from giving them a variety of patterns that are close to each other but different, whether it's by meter or whether it's the same meter but the pattern itself has changed, it makes each of the musical ideas or patterns more precise in the student's mind. And that's really what induction is. It's the process of helping someone triangulate things. So discrimination learning in the way that we talk about it in MLT, where you have to repeat things, is an integral part of that. Because if you can't repeat it, then obviously you don't have the right musical object in your mind or audiated pattern. But I mean, there's a lot there, Eric. Like, what is that? You've been in this carnival for a while. What does that bring up for you in terms of the way you think about this?
So to get at something, and Gordon says this, right? To get at something, to understand something, you got to understand what it's not. But what's the heart of presenting that, that concept of, hey, that's not the right one. Can you tell me that's right or not right? Is this the one I've been showing you or not the one I've been showing you? And all I want kids to do is that basic level of discrimination without having to imitate.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right? They don't have to imitate to audiate. Of course, I get kids to audiate, functions at 2.5, 3 years old sometimes. Not everybody. But, and those guys are not, so there's a missing piece here where you're providing a new experience that contradicts at some level or is just different from the thing that they've learned. And they learn it better by, okay, this is not that. So it's like when you're presenting colors, red, 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 red. This is red. This is a red truck. This is a red piece of paper, a red car, a red S, red that. Is this red? And you show them something that's not red. And no is the answer. Not that, no, it's blue. No, it's not time to say blue. It's just time to say that's not red because you know what red is. And you don't say blue. So don't teach them, their colors 5, here's our 5 colors. No, you just pick a color and this is that color and we use that color. He says the color, she says the color, there's the color, this is the color. Oh, that's a different kind of color red. That's a different, oh, interesting. These are all kind of similar, but, they're not exactly the same red. And then, is this red? No. And that's all you need.
So the question here is, why do we need this language of induction? Because isn't what Gordon said about same and different enough? And I would claim that it's not, because...
It can be, but it's not...
No, it can be, and someone may apply it in the exact way that I'm saying would be useful. But the way that Engelman talks about it is there's a precise way to actually sequence what you show someone in what order to make it more possible that they're going to know what you're pointing at. So like if you just generally play a lot of major and minor songs, generally do a lot of duple and triple patterns, they're going to have all this content in their mind. But if you precisely, and this is what we do in partial synthesis, by the way, we precisely show the one shift that matters. But what I'm saying is that partial synthesis, and we're going to get into this, is really, it's all about oral.
We'll bring this up in a separate episode because there's enough juice in partial synthesis to light the space shuttle.
So, I mean, one of Engelman's claims is that depending on how you sequence this stuff, going back to your example of teaching colors to kids, red. So, you show a red truck, a red ball, a red teacup. So now the kids are like, well, it's not the shape, it's the color. But then you have to give negative examples of, like, you go from a red truck, and you say, that's red, to the same truck but blue. Say, that's not red. You don't say that's blue, you just say it's not red. And so you can sequence the examples in a way where you have such a high likelihood that the student's going to know exactly what you're talking about. And Engelman goes as far, and we're going to really get into this, as not using any label until you do that process, which opens a big can of worms for how you look at what the skill learning sequence is. So, I mean, what has, I'm sure you had heard about what induction was before I started, I don't know what you want to call it, badgering you with theory of instruction. But, I mean, what has this changed in your own thinking or your own teaching? Just knowing more clearly about this idea of induction versus the way that, because Gordon's talking about something very similar. It's just they use different wording and concepts to get at the same thing.
I never tried to teach the way Gordon proposed. It wasn't his job. His job was to educate me in the theory of how children learn. So who's the expert in that? All my kids. Mm-hmm. So I'm following my kids. And only by some, either a lot of mistakes or, just trial and error, over 20 years, trying to get the kids to audiate major and minor. Each year I kind of take one thing and I go after it hard. Like I'll go after tonalities, and I got, my kids to do 6 or 7 tonalities and, in a year or a year and a half. And I would just go after that. Or I go after, when I started my functional training, that was like, that's all it consumed to me for a while. All the while also doing rhythm patterns and tonal patterns, just not the same intensity with the same goal in mind. Like how far can I get to my kids to improvise? So, within 2 or 3 months, they know the blues. I know
you did the same thing with like symbolic association.
Yeah,
there was
one
a while
time
where you were like driving that.
I went crazy with symbolic association and had the kids write their own 5/8 and 7/8 patterns. By the time
I'm sure the parents like that.
Well, parents didn't know. In fact, my colleagues didn't know.
Or maybe the colleagues liked that.
They didn't know.
That's how you impress non-MLT music colleagues, is just show them symbolic association at work.
Yeah. Well, these kids, first time they ever wrote an unusual meter, or BB ants. Big beats are not the same size, because there's no unusual meter if they're used to it. So the way I teach is everybody gets used to everything as soon as possible. So the first time they wrote these, and I just gave them a couple examples up on the board, and they recognized them. It's like, so now they could read them. So now when they're creating them, this is the first time they've written in 5/8 or 7/8, and they could go bada 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 bada, or they could do bada bada bada, or 5/8 could be bada bada bada, or bada bada bada. But most of the patterns they knew already were more familiar. The ones they're more familiar with were the bigger beat was the first of the series. So ba 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 ba. So 3/8 then 2, and the same thing with 7/8, or the longer beat was the first one. Yep.
So
okay,
so now
they can create quickly if they already know that. So bottom line is, what the kids tell me they're ready for, and you're listening to them, they're able to inductively learn things where they fall into the teaching themselves. You're opening the door, making it very explicit. Opening the door means walk through. You just, all you're doing is open the door and they walk through. And it's that simple in terms of what they're ready for, if you know that they're ready. And I don't know how to tell you when they're ready, except you got to just keep listening to the room, or listening to the kids, looking for what's funny and fun, what's easy. If they're having a hard time getting something, I try to get off of it. I don't try to bang the drum harder at all. It just doesn't work.
That deserves its own conversation.
Yeah. So I just back off and give them something that's so easy for them that they feel, oh yeah, I feel good about my learning, because they know it. And that's what you want to do, is make learning as easy as possible.
I think that's why they hire us.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, the way you discovered the yes/no game and teaching harmonic functions is just a perfect example of how induction works, because you were in relation to watching what the students are ready for, because you were trying to teach the concept of resting tone, but it's like there's a resting function, and then you immediately jumped into these other things. And if you had not followed your gut on them being ready to learn that kind of stuff, I mean,
yeah, no, it was just kind of obvious, because it really clicked in them. This was first, second grade, and then my next cut at that is, okay, so what am I doing to make this so hard that they can't do it in kindergarten? So it's me. What am I doing that makes it so hard that they can't get it in pre-K? And then Well, 3 years old, at some point, the Engelmann theory, you can't talk to a 6-month-old baby and teach them major and minor. But there's the readiness, and at some point, the child has a psychological readiness or a physical readiness. It's got enough neurons in the brain, enough language that they understand yes and no. Certainly by
actually, once they understand yes and no, I mean, you can start doing a lot with that because when you're guiding students to make discriminations, if you can say that's not this or that is this, that's all you need to start this whole process.
And there's such an explosion of what they need that happens between 1 and a couple months of, say, 15, 16 months old, and by the time they're 2, it's crazy how much vocabulary they master in that time frame.
So we should talk about how we've been talking about a lot here how Engelmann supports Gordon's ideas and maybe brings another level of precision or a different way of looking at it. But what's interesting is if you understand MLT, you will probably be able to read theory of instruction much more easily than almost any teacher, because the whole point of what Engelmann's getting at with how induction works is very similar to what Gordon's talking about. And I wanted to talk about this because vocabulary, and we were talking about this last week off air, Eric, but the process of learning vocabulary, just everyday language, when you're younger, is not a process of learning the sounds of new words and memorizing their definitions. It's the process of actually learning what those words mean without language. So the concept, that's what I call a concept. So, and you can see this with kids. You work with a lot of young kids. How many kids don't know what left and right is? And how many times do teachers try to say, hold up this hand, that's left, hold up. I mean, that's an imitation kind of learning. This is left, this is right, this is right. But that's not actually helping them make the conceptual distinction in their mind that the label right needs to stick onto. And, it's fun. Now, since I've read Theory of Instruction, I will gladly take a minute or two in a lesson and teach a 5-year-old what left and right is if I notice that, no one else has properly got in there and do that. Because if you don't know how to do it, it's not that clear. But
yeah, no,
it's just what I'm getting at is this is not just music related. This is like globally how people learn, whether it's philosophy, language,
and it's intuitive once you get into the meat of it, because I didn't read Theory of Instruction at all, but it was all over what I'm doing. Problem is I was doing it unintentionally or less intentionally than I can now, reading the more the specific the way to present what I was teaching.
Which he calls the sequencing of examples.
There you go.
Yeah, and that's what.
And it's obvious, of course I sequence my examples, but it's like, but if you don't, like how you layer things in and the amount of repetition you need. I've never done, I thought, I got to do all this repetition, I'm going to lose time. And the fact of the matter is that you gain time doing the repetition because you never have to go back for stuff that you used to.
Actually, the repetition is another point we should touch on before we close, is that if you have this model of discrimination learning that's like imitation leads to discrimination learning, repetition seems like the tool that you use to drive it in. But repetition without changing the examples and providing variation does not give the mind the chance to make the discrimination it needs to make. Just hammering the same thing over and over again.
Which makes you think about partial synthesis. Where does that fit in? Now we're stirring the waters a little deeper.
Don't worry, the Jenga house of MLT will crash down in the next episode.
So, yeah, we've got that one perched on a high cliff somewhere. We're going to kick it off.
So if, we talk about theory of instruction probably more than we talk about learning sequences of music, but I just think it's such a valuable tool for MLT teachers to have. But we'll link to a download of it if we haven't already. But in this episode, hopefully we'll link to
it's in a former. It's definitely in a former note. Podcast note, but we'll do it again. But yeah, there's this is so exciting. The way to talk through what is really making a difference for me and being more efficient and effective as a teacher with regard to, concepts, whether that concept is a word, a label, or whether that concept is a pattern or something that's like what you're talking about as an object.
Yeah, and I like that term. To me, concept is what the labels are actually pointing at. It's not the label.
Yeah.
The concept. And you brought up this really interesting point that people can think without language in their mind, and we clearly do.
Yeah.
Because the labels are just pointing at the concepts you're thinking. And this is why I think you get a lot of mathematicians and philosophers who they just kind of go for walks, and they're not deductively like going, this means that, so that means this, and then this. They're just kind of just letting their mind wander, because the thinking process is not necessarily linguistic. The language can help facilitate the process in writing and conversation, but the underlying concepts are not necessarily linguistic. And same with audiation.
Yeah. Chomsky didn't have a handle on every little thing that we know now, although he's brilliant and brought us very
I think he was
far.
pretty smart, though, wasn't he?
But there are people who disagree with him, and if you take their point of view for a minute, it's not that they're right and Chomsky's wrong at all. It's just more to scare up and more to deal with and try to understand, because we have so much more, brain scans and all these other kind of tools that help us. Somebody who can't, so somebody who doesn't, is not a musician at all, and is having a hallucination that's really loud of music being played, and it changes in context, depends on where he is or whatever, and they put him under a CT scan, and his brain is the same as a musician's brain who's actually listening to the same piece. It's exactly the same. It's like, what explains that? Or people who are deaf, who used to listen to music, and it's crazy, and it doesn't make sense, some of it. And we're trying to.
I don't know. That makes sense to me. That's not because my mind is like, well, there has to be some plausible mechanism to why the hallucination has this like level of reality that's like listening to music, and surprise, because the brain looks the same while it's doing both those things.
Yeah,
that part of it seems quite.
That's off of a Oliver Sacks. It's probably in Musicophilia, the book Musicophilia, which is a really interesting read. Oliver Sacks was brilliant too.
Yeah, musical hallucinations are interesting topic we might want to get into.
All right, but 2024, right. Put it on our agenda.
All right, till next time.
All right, thanks.